I attended my best friend's baby's first birthday. She offered me a slice of cake. My neighbor baked it special. I'm a toxicologist. I noticed the smell and panic flooded through me. I grabbed her arm hard. Don't let anyone eat that. The cake was poisoned. The smell hit me before the knife touched the frosting. Lydia was standing there with her hand on the cake server, smiling at the 15 guests crowded into her small dining room, and all I could think was that something was wrong. Terribly, chemically, unmistakably wrong. My training kicked in before my brain could catch up. I grabbed her wrist so hard that she dropped the server and it clattered against the table, and I said the words that would change everything. Don't let anyone eat that. The room went silent. Oliver, her 1-year-old, was sitting in his high chair with frosting already smeared on his tiny fingers. My stomach dropped through the floor. I looked at those fingers, then at his face, searching for any sign that he'd actually tasted it. Lydia was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Her husband, Greg, had already taken a step toward me, his jaw tight, protective instincts flaring. But I couldn't explain, not yet, not with the panic coursing through me. All I knew was that beneath the vanilla and buttercream, there was something else. Something that smelled like bitter almonds. Something that shouldn't exist in any cake baked by a friendly neighbor. I'd been working as a toxicologist at the state crime lab for 11 years when that birthday party happened. People always ask what that job is like, and I tell them it's mostly paperwork and lab work and court testimony, nothing like the crime shows make it seem. But the truth is, after more than a decade of analyzing poisoning cases, you develop a sixth sense. You start noticing things normal people don't. The way certain substances have distinctive odors, the way they interact with food, the way they present in victims. I'd testified in 38 homicide cases. I'd helped identify poisons in situations where the cause of death had baffled medical examiners for months. None of that prepared me for finding a poisoned cake at my best friend's baby's first birthday party. Lydia and I had been friends since college. We'd been roommates freshman year, bonded over late-night study sessions and terrible dining hall food, and stayed close through everything that came after. She'd been there when my engagement fell apart. I'd been there when she met Greg, when they got married, when she found out she was pregnant. When Oliver was born, I was at the hospital within an hour. I'd held that baby when he was less than a day old. The party was on a Saturday afternoon in late April. Lydia had gone all out with decorations, blue and white balloons everywhere, a banner that said, "Happy First Birthday, Oliver," strung across the living room. The guest list was mostly family, Greg's parents, Lydia's mom, a few aunts and uncles, plus a handful of close friends. I'd arrived early to help set up, and I'd noticed the cake sitting on the counter almost immediately. It was beautiful, a 3-tier creation covered in pale blue fondant with little white stars and a crescent moon on top. Lydia had told me her neighbor Denise had insisted on making it. "She's been so helpful since the baby came," Lydia said, her voice warm with gratitude. "Always bringing over casseroles, offering to babysit. I don't know what we'd do without her." I'd met Denise Whitmore exactly twice before that day. She was a woman in her mid-50s, widowed about 3 years earlier, living alone in the house next door. She seemed pleasant enough, if a little intense, the kind of person who remembered every detail about your life and brought it up in conversation later. Looking back, there were signs I should have noticed, but hindsight is cruel that way. The moment I smelled that cake, my training took over completely. I grabbed Lydia's wrist to stop her from cutting it, and then I was moving, my body operating on autopilot while my mind raced through possibilities. I checked Oliver's hands first, frosting on his fingers, yes, but had he eaten any? I looked at his face, his lips, searched for any trace of blue frosting around his mouth. Nothing. He'd been playing with it but hadn't actually tasted it yet. The relief that flooded through me was immediately replaced by fresh panic when I realized 3 other children were at the party. Greg's niece and nephew, ages 4 and 6, and Lydia's cousin's daughter, who was 5. Any of them could have already gotten into the cake. Any of them could have licked frosting off their fingers or been given a taste by a well-meaning adult. I turned to the room and said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "Has anyone eaten any of this cake yet? Any of the children?" The confusion on everyone's faces would have been almost comical in any other circumstance. Greg's mother was looking at me like I'd grown a second head. Lydia's cousin was holding her daughter closer, suddenly uncertain. Greg stepped forward then, his voice low and controlled but clearly annoyed. "Nathan, what the hell is going on? You just ruined the cake cutting and you're scaring everyone." I understood his frustration. From his perspective, I was his wife's college friend who had just made an incredibly bizarre scene at their son's first birthday. But I couldn't worry about his feelings right now. "I need everyone to answer me," I said. "Has anyone eaten any of this cake? Even a small amount? Even just tasting the frosting?" Slow shakes of heads around the room. Lydia's mom said she'd thought about taking a taste of the frosting but hadn't gotten around to it. Greg's sister confirmed that her kids had been asking, but she'd told them to wait until after the singing. The relief was so intense I nearly sat down right there on the floor. But I wasn't finished. I turned to Lydia, who was still staring at me with a mixture of confusion and hurt, and said quietly, "I need to talk to you and Greg. Privately. Right now." She must have seen something in my face that told her I wasn't joking, because she nodded. We went into the kitchen, leaving the guests murmuring in the dining room, and I closed the door behind us. "This cake has been poisoned," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I'm almost certain of it. There's a distinct smell of cyanide compounds mixed with the vanilla. Most people wouldn't notice it, but I've worked with these substances for over a decade. I'm not wrong about this." The color drained from Lydia's face. Greg looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to tell me I was being paranoid or dramatic, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the certainty in my voice. Maybe it was the fact that he knew what I did for a living. "Cyanide," he repeated slowly. "You're telling me someone put cyanide in my son's birthday cake?" I nodded. "Specifically, I suspect potassium cyanide, or possibly amygdalin in a concentrated form. The bitter almond smell is unmistakable once you know what to look for. It's partially masked by the vanilla extract in the frosting, which is clever. Vanilla can cover a lot of odors, but not completely." Lydia's hand was pressed against her mouth. Her eyes were filling with tears. "Denise made that cake," she whispered. "Denise wouldn't. She's been so kind to us. Why would she?" I didn't have an answer to that question. Not yet. But I knew we needed to move fast. I told them to keep everyone away from the cake, not to let anyone touch it under any circumstances. Then I called my colleague at the lab, Dr. Amara Okonkwo, who was the senior forensic toxicologist and one of the sharpest analytical chemists I'd ever worked with. She answered on the third ring, sounding surprised to hear from me on a Saturday. I explained the situation as quickly as I could, and her response was immediate and serious. "Don't let anyone touch it. Bag it if you can, seal it, keep the chain of custody clean. I can meet you at the lab in 45 minutes. She paused. "Nathan, are you sure about this? False positive on smell alone would be—" "I'm sure," I said. "You know I wouldn't call if I wasn't." She did know. That's why she didn't argue further. I went back to the dining room and, as calmly as possible, told the guests that there had been a problem with the cake and it couldn't be served. I apologized for the disruption. I suggested everyone enjoy the other food and that Lydia would sort things out. Most people seemed to accept this explanation, though the looks they were giving me ranged from sympathetic to suspicious. I carefully placed the entire cake, stand and all, into a large garbage bag from Lydia's kitchen and sealed it. My hands were steady. They had to be. The party dissolved quickly after that. Guests made their excuses and left, shooting uncertain glances at Lydia and Greg as they gathered their things. By 4 o'clock, the house was empty, except for the three of us and Oliver, who was getting fussy from all the disruption to his routine. Lydia put him down for a nap, while Greg and I sat in the living room not speaking. I could feel his anger radiating off him, the desperate need to believe I was wrong, that I had just destroyed his son's birthday party for nothing. I understood that anger. I even respected it. But I also knew that if I was right, his anger was the least of our problems. When Lydia came back downstairs, I told them I was taking the cake to the lab immediately. I said I'd call them as soon as I knew anything concrete. Lydia hugged me, and I could feel her trembling. "What if you're wrong?" she whispered. I pulled back and looked at her. "Then I'll apologize to everyone personally. I'll pay for a new party, a new cake, whatever you want." I paused. "But I'm not wrong, Lydia. I wish I was." The drive to the lab took 23 minutes. I broke several traffic laws getting there, the sealed bag sitting on the passenger seat like a bomb I was racing to defuse. Dr. Okonkwo was already waiting when I arrived, wearing weekend clothes but with gloves on and a determined expression. We went straight to the main analysis room, and I talked her through what I'd observed while she prepped the samples. She cut small sections from 3 different areas of the cake, the top tier, the middle tier, and the bottom tier, and prepared them for gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. While we waited for the first results, she ran a preliminary Prussian blue test on a small sample of the frosting. The test strip turned the telltale shade within seconds. "Well," she said quietly, "your nose didn't lie." But she wanted confirmation, and so did I. We waited for the GCMS results, not speaking much, the hum of the equipment filling the silence. When the data came through, Amara pulled it up on the screen and we both leaned in to look. The presence of hydrogen cyanide was unmistakable, showing up in multiple fractions of the sample at concentrations well above lethal thresholds. Amara ran the numbers twice, then a third time. The concentration of cyanide in that cake was approximately 24 milligrams per serving, assuming standard slice sizes. A lethal dose for an adult is typically between 100 and 300 milligrams, depending on body weight and individual tolerance. But for a 1-year-old baby weighing around 20 pounds, a single bite could have been fatal. Maybe not immediately, but within minutes. The realization hit me with physical force. Oliver had had frosting on his fingers. If he'd stuck those fingers in his mouth, if anyone had given him a taste before the official cake cutting, he would be dead right now. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Amara was looking at me with something like horror in her eyes. "Nathan," she said carefully, "this isn't accidental contamination. This level of concentration, distributed evenly throughout multiple tiers. This is deliberate. This is attempted murder." I nodded. My throat felt too tight to speak. She continued, her voice taking on the professional detachment we both use to cope with the worst parts of our job. "We need to call the police. This has to go through official channels. Chain of custody is already compromised since you transported it yourself, but we documented everything from the moment you arrived. It should hold up." I called Lydia before I called the police. She deserved to hear it from me first. Her voice was shaking when she answered, and I knew she'd been waiting by the phone. "It's confirmed," I said. "The cake contained a lethal concentration of potassium cyanide, enough to kill a child with a single bite. Lydia, I'm so sorry, but you need to call 911. This is now a criminal matter." The sound she made on the other end of the line will stay with me forever. It was somewhere between a scream and a sob, a sound of pure terror mixed with dawning comprehension. Greg got on the phone, and I repeated everything to him. To his credit, he didn't argue or question me this time. He just said, "We're calling right now." I gave him Amara's direct line and told him to have the responding officers contact her for the lab results. Then I sat in that sterile lab room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and tried to process the fact that someone had tried to kill my best friend's baby. Not just tried, planned it, researched it, acquired the poison, baked it into a beautiful 3-tier cake, decorated it with stars and moons, and delivered it with a smile. The police arrived at Lydia's house within 15 minutes of her call. I drove back to meet them, breaking more traffic laws than I had on the way to the lab. By the time I got there, 2 patrol cars were parked outside, and Lydia was standing on the porch with Greg, both of them looking shell-shocked. The lead responding officer was a sergeant named Delgado, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd already taken preliminary statements and called for detective support. "You're the one who identified the poison?" she asked me. I nodded and gave her a brief version of my credentials: 11 years at the state crime lab, expertise in toxicology, the specific training that had allowed me to recognize the smell. She didn't seem skeptical exactly, but she was careful. Careful was good. We needed everything done right. Within the hour, a detective arrived. Lieutenant Raymond Vance, 22 years with the department, currently assigned to the Major Crimes Unit. He was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. He listened to my account, took notes, asked precise questions. Lieutenant Vance wanted to interview Denise Whitmore immediately, but he wanted to do it carefully. "If she's the one who did this," he said, "we need to build a solid case before she knows she's a suspect. Right now, the story is that there was a problem with the cake. It made some guests sick. We're investigating food contamination. That gives us room to work." He asked Lydia and Greg to provide everything they knew about Denise, how long she'd lived next door, when they'd first met her, the nature of their interactions. As they talked, a picture began to emerge that made my skin crawl. Denise had moved into the house next door approximately 18 months ago, shortly after Oliver was conceived. She'd introduced herself to Lydia early in the pregnancy, mentioned that she'd lost her husband recently and was looking for community, offered to help with anything the young couple might need. From there, her presence in their lives had grown steadily. She brought meals when Lydia was in her 3rd trimester and too exhausted to cook. She ran errands when Greg was at work. After Oliver was born, she became even more involved, babysitting occasionally, dropping by with gifts for the baby, always available to help. Lydia's voice was trembling as she recounted all of this. "She was so nice," she kept saying. "She never asked for anything in return. I thought she was just lonely, that helping us gave her purpose. I felt sorry for her." Greg put his arm around her shoulders. His face was tight with barely contained rage, the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been deceived about something as fundamental as who is safe to trust. Lieutenant Vance asked if they'd noticed anything strange about Denise's behavior, anything that had seemed off in retrospect. At first, they both said no. But then Greg frowned and mentioned something. "There was this one time," he said slowly. "Maybe 6 months ago. I came home early from work and Denise was here, sitting with Oliver while Lydia napped. She was holding him, and when I walked in, the look on her face was strange, like I'd interrupted something private. She handed him over right away, made some excuse about needing to leave. But the way she looked at him before she let go," he shook his head, struggling to articulate it. "It was possessive, like he was hers." The investigation moved fast after that. Lieutenant Vance coordinated with the district attorney's office to obtain search warrants for Denise's home. A forensic team from the crime lab, a different unit than mine to avoid any conflict of interest, was put on standby. Background checks were initiated. I stayed at Lydia's house, unable to leave, feeling responsible for seeing this through. It was well past midnight when Lieutenant Vance called to update us. The background check had returned something disturbing. Denise Whitmore was not her real name. She'd legally changed it 7 years ago, shortly after the death of her son. Before that, she'd been Denise Fairbanks, and her son had been Thomas Fairbanks, age 4 when he died. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. But here was the thing that made Lieutenant Vance's voice go flat and careful. Thomas had died in the backyard swimming pool of a babysitter. A babysitter named Lydia Porter, who was 18 years old at the time and working her first summer job before starting college. Lydia's face went white when we told her. For a long moment, she didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there staring at nothing while the information settled into her brain. Then she started to shake, a full-body tremor that made the couch cushions vibrate. "I remember him," she whispered. "I remember Tommy. Oh, God." She'd been babysitting for the Fairbanks family 3 times a week that summer. They had a pool in the backyard. Tommy was 4 years old, energetic and curious, difficult to keep track of. On the afternoon it happened, Lydia had turned her back for maybe 2 minutes to answer a phone call inside the house. When she came back out, Tommy was floating face down in the pool. She'd jumped in, pulled him out, tried CPR, called 911, but it was too late. The official investigation had ruled it an accident. No charges were filed against Lydia. The Fairbanks family had been devastated but hadn't blamed her publicly, at least not at first. Lydia had spent years in therapy dealing with the guilt, working through the trauma. She'd thought she'd put it behind her. Now everything made a horrible kind of sense. Denise Fairbanks, mother of the boy who drowned, had tracked Lydia down, changed her name, moved in next door, spent a year and a half building trust, building access, waiting for the perfect moment. And when Lydia's son turned 1 year old, the same age Tommy had been when Lydia started babysitting him, Denise had baked a cake full of poison and handed it over with a smile. An eye for an eye. A child for a child. The depth of planning, the patience required, the cold calculation of it all. I'd seen a lot of terrible things in my career, but this was something else entirely. This was hatred refined into its purest form, aged like a fine poison over years of obsessive grief. Lieutenant Vance asked Lydia if she had any documentation from that summer, anything that might help establish the connection. She shook her head, still trembling. It had been 17 years. She'd thrown away everything associated with that time, wanting to forget. But then Greg remembered something. The newspaper had covered the drowning when it happened. It was a small town, and a child's death made the local news. The article would have mentioned Lydia by name as the babysitter present at the time. It wouldn't have accused her of anything. There were no accusations to make. But it would have established the connection between her and the Fairbanks family. More importantly, it might have mentioned details that Denise could have used to track Lydia down years later. Lieutenant Vance made a note and said he'd have someone pull the newspaper archives. Meanwhile, the search warrant for Denise's house had been approved. He was heading there now with the forensic team. I asked if I could come. He hesitated, then said I could observe from outside but couldn't enter the premises or interfere with the search. I agreed and followed him to the street where Lydia's nightmare had been quietly festering for nearly 2 years. Denise's house was dark when we arrived at 3:15 in the morning. Lieutenant Vance knocked on the door, identified himself, and waited. No response. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. After the third attempt with no answer, he nodded to the forensic team, and they began the process of making entry. I stood on the sidewalk with another officer, watching as they went inside. My heart was pounding despite the distance, adrenaline keeping me alert even though I hadn't slept in almost 24 hours. The minutes stretched out interminably. Then Lieutenant Vance emerged from the front door and walked toward me, and I knew from his expression that they'd found something significant. "She's not here," he said. "But her car is in the garage, and there's evidence she left in a hurry. Clothes pulled out of drawers, bathroom toiletries missing." He paused. "We also found what appears to be a makeshift laboratory in the basement. Chemical supplies, glassware, notebooks, and photographs. Hundreds of them." The photographs were the worst part. Lieutenant Vance didn't show them to me directly, chain of custody again, but he described what they'd found. Pictures of Lydia, taken over months or possibly years. Lydia shopping, walking her dog, going to doctor's appointments during her pregnancy. Pictures of the house at different times of day, noting when Greg left for work, when Lydia was alone. And pictures of Oliver in his stroller, Oliver in the backyard, Oliver visible through windows. Some of the photos had dates written on the back in careful handwriting. The earliest was from more than 2 years ago, before Oliver was even conceived. Denise had been watching Lydia for years before she ever introduced herself. She'd been planning this from the beginning. In the basement lab, they found notebooks detailing Denise's research into poisons, extraction methods, and dosage calculations. She'd considered several different substances before settling on potassium cyanide, and her notes explained why. Fast-acting, difficult to trace unless you knew what to look for, and poetically appropriate. Her own son had died because he couldn't breathe. Cyanide killed by preventing cells from using oxygen. In her twisted mind, there was symmetry in that. An APB was issued for Denise Whitmore, also known as Denise Fairbanks, with alerts sent to airports, bus stations, and border crossings. Her bank accounts were flagged for activity. Lieutenant Vance was confident they'd find her quickly. She'd left in a hurry, which meant she'd made mistakes. I went home around 5 in the morning, exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced before. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Oliver's tiny fingers covered in blue frosting, and I thought about how close he'd come to putting them in his mouth. How close we'd all come to watching him die at his own birthday party while his mother screamed and there was nothing anyone could have done. My training had saved his life. The accumulated knowledge of 11 years in a crime lab, the countless hours studying toxicology, the cases that had given me nightmares, all of it had been worth it for that one moment of recognition. But I also knew how easily it could have gone differently. If the party had been somewhere else, if I'd arrived late, if Lydia had served the cake before I got there. The what-ifs were endless and terrifying. They found Denise 3 days later. She'd driven to a cabin in the mountains that had belonged to her late husband's family, a property no one had thought to check initially because it was in a different name. She was sitting on the porch when the state police arrived, looking out at the trees, seemingly unsurprised to see them. According to Lieutenant Vance, who called me with the update, she didn't resist arrest. She didn't say much either, except for one thing. He was supposed to be mine. She was supposed to know how it felt. They brought her back to stand trial, and the wheels of justice began their slow grinding. The DA charged her with attempted murder, and because the intended victim was a child under the age of 2, she also faced additional charges for attempted murder of a vulnerable person. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the notebooks, the laboratory equipment, the toxicology results from the cake. Her own obsessive documentation had created an airtight case against her. Patricia Nguyen, the prosecutor assigned to the case, told me it was one of the most complete evidentiary files she'd ever worked with. The trial began 4 months later, after various preliminary hearings and failed attempts by Denise's public defender to negotiate a plea deal. Denise refused to plead guilty to anything, insisted on her right to a jury trial, and seemed to view the proceedings as an opportunity to tell her story rather than a legal threat to her freedom. I was called as an expert witness, which I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was how difficult it would be to sit in that courtroom and describe, in clinical detail, exactly how the poison in that cake would have killed a 1-year-old baby. The mechanism of cyanide toxicity, the timeline of symptoms, the progression from confusion to convulsions to cardiac arrest. Lydia was in the gallery, and I saw her crying silently as I testified. Greg sat next to her, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Oliver wasn't there, of course. He was with Lydia's mother, blissfully unaware that his first birthday had almost been his last. Denise took the stand in her own defense, against her lawyer's advice. She spoke for nearly 2 hours, telling the story of her son Tommy and the summer day he died. She described how she'd come home from work to find paramedics in her driveway and her husband on his knees in the grass, how she'd watched them carry her son's small body out of the backyard on a stretcher, how the teenage babysitter, Lydia, had stood there crying, and all Denise could think was that this girl got to cry, got to be the victim of her own negligence, while Tommy was dead and would never cry again. She talked about the years that followed, her husband's suicide 3 years later, her spiral into grief and obsession. She'd tried therapy, she said, tried medication, tried forgiveness. Nothing worked. The only thing that made her feel anything was the thought of justice, real justice, the kind the legal system had denied her when it ruled Tommy's death an accident and let Lydia walk away without consequence. By the time she started talking about finding Lydia, moving next door, becoming part of her life, the jury was visibly disturbed. Some of them were parents themselves. You could see it in their faces, the way they recoiled when Denise described watching Oliver through windows, noting his routines, calculating the perfect moment to strike. She wasn't remorseful. She wasn't even trying to appear remorseful. She seemed to think that if she could just make them understand the depth of her loss, they would see her actions as justified. She took everything from me, Denise said, looking directly at Lydia in the gallery. She took my son. She got to go to college, get married, have a baby of her own. She got to live like nothing happened while I had nothing left. Don't you understand? She should have paid. Someone should have made her pay. The prosecutor, Patricia Nguyen, handled the cross-examination with surgical precision. She established that Lydia had been a teenager at the time of Tommy's drowning, that she'd tried to save him, that the investigation had found no evidence of negligence or wrongdoing. Patricia presented the findings from Denise's basement laboratory, the meticulous notes describing her poison research and dosage calculations. She asked Denise directly, "You knew that the concentration of cyanide in that cake was sufficient to kill a child, didn't you?" Denise answered without hesitation, "Yes, that was the point." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave her 35 years without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the intended victim, and Denise's complete lack of remorse. She was 61 years old. She would likely die in prison. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing, and I watched her face as the judge pronounced the number. She didn't react at all. Just sat there with the same flat, empty expression she'd worn throughout the trial. I'd seen a lot of criminals in my career, testified in dozens of cases, encountered people who had done terrible things for terrible reasons. But Denise Whitmore frightened me in a way none of the others had, because her hatred hadn't burned hot. It had frozen into something patient and methodical, something that could wait for years, could smile and bring casseroles and babysit infants while calculating exactly how to destroy them. After the trial, life went back to something approximating normal, though it could never be the same. Lydia and Greg sold their house within 6 months. They couldn't bear to live next door to the place where Denise had watched them, planned her revenge, baked her poison cake. They moved across the city to a new neighborhood where no one knew their story. Oliver grew and thrived, blissfully unaware of how close he'd come to never growing at all. Lydia started seeing a new therapist, one who specialized in trauma. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't the fear, it was the guilt. I keep thinking about Tommy, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've thought about him for 17 years, but now it's different. Now I think about how his mother loved him so much that losing him broke her completely. And I think about how that broken woman tried to kill my son, and I don't know how to hold both of those things in my head at the same time. I didn't have an answer for her. I'm not sure anyone does. Dr. Amara Okonkwo and I published a paper together about the case, with identifying details removed, for a forensic toxicology journal. The focus was on the detection of cyanide compounds in food matrices and the importance of sensory recognition training for first responders and medical professionals. It was well received in our field, cited several times in subsequent literature. But I didn't write it for the citations or the professional recognition. I wrote it because I kept thinking about all the birthday parties, all the potlucks, all the shared meals where something terrible could be hiding in plain sight. I wanted other people to know what to look for. I wanted to give them the same chance that my training had given Oliver. Lieutenant Raymond Vance retired from the police force the following year, after 23 years of service. He told me at the retirement party that the Whitmore case had been one of the strangest of his career, and he'd investigated some genuinely strange things. The patience of it, he said, shaking his head. The years she spent building up to it. That's what gets me. Most killers, they act in the moment. They're impulsive. They make mistakes. She made a plan and stuck to it for years. That takes a kind of dedication most people can't even imagine. I've thought about his words a lot in the time since. What drives someone to that kind of dedication? Grief, obviously. Loss. The feeling that something unbearable has happened and the universe has failed to balance the scales. I understand grief. I've experienced loss. But I've never felt the urge to make someone else's child pay for my pain. I've never looked at an innocent baby and seen an instrument of revenge. Whatever was broken in Denise Whitmore was broken beyond anything I can comprehend, and I'm grateful for that incomprehension. It means there are depths of darkness I haven't had to explore. Oliver is 3 years old now. He's loud and curious and exhausting in the way that all 3-year-olds are, and every time I see him, I remember the feel of that garbage bag in my hands as I sealed the poisoned cake inside it. I remember the numbers on the GCMS readout, the concentration levels that would have stopped his tiny heart. I remember Lydia's face when I told her the results were confirmed. And I remember Denise Whitmore's flat, empty eyes as the judge sentenced her to spend the rest of her life in prison. Some people have asked me if I feel like a hero. I don't. Not really. I feel like someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right training to recognize something terrible before it was too late. Luck and preparation colliding in a single moment that changed everything. If I'd arrived at that party 5 minutes later, if Oliver had put those frosting-covered fingers in his mouth before I noticed the smell, if Lydia had served the cake before the official cutting, the outcome would have been different. The fact that none of those things happened isn't heroism. It's grace, or chance, or whatever you want to call the random forces that sometimes align to prevent tragedy. What I do feel is vigilant. More vigilant than I was before, more aware of the potential for harm hiding in ordinary places. I pay attention to my surroundings differently now. I notice things. Smells, textures, the way people look at each other, the patterns of behavior that might signal something wrong beneath the surface. Maybe that's paranoia. Maybe it's just the natural result of learning, viscerally and permanently, that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it bakes a beautiful cake and rings your doorbell with a smile. Lydia and I are still close. We talk at least once a week, see each other for dinners and holidays, maintain the friendship that started back in that college dorm room decades ago. But there's something different in the way she looks at me now. Not just gratitude, though that's part of it. Something deeper. Something that acknowledges the magnitude of what happened between us. I saved her son's life. That's not the kind of thing you can ever really repay or move past. It becomes part of the foundation of the relationship, a weight that both of us carry, a debt that can never be settled, because settling it would mean quantifying the value of a child's life. So we don't try to settle it. We just keep going, keep being friends, keep watching Oliver grow and celebrating his birthdays with store-bought cakes that Lydia inspects with excessive care before serving. She laughs about it now, calls herself paranoid, but I notice that she never asks anyone else to bake for her anymore, and I don't blame her at all. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't become a toxicologist. If I'd pursued a different career, followed a different path, never learned to recognize the smell of bitter almonds hidden beneath vanilla frosting. Oliver would be dead. Lydia would be destroyed. Denise would have gotten away with it, at least for a while, until some medical examiner thought to test for unusual compounds in a baby's autopsy. The cascade of pain would have rippled outward, touching everyone connected to that family, changing lives in ways I can barely imagine. But I did become a toxicologist. I did learn what I learned. And when the moment came, I was ready. That's the only version of events that matters now, the only reality we have to live with. Oliver is alive, Denise is in prison, Lydia is healing, slowly, and I'm still doing my job, still analyzing samples, still testifying in court, still carrying the knowledge that lets me recognize poison when I smell it. It's not a superpower. It's just training, dedication, and the willingness to trust my own senses even when trusting them means ruining a birthday party in front of 15 confused guests. There's a lesson in this story, though I'm not sure exactly how to articulate it. Something about paying attention, maybe. Something about trusting your instincts when they're screaming at you that something is wrong. Something about the way evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a helpful neighbor with a beautiful cake. The world is full of dangers, obvious and hidden, and most of the time we navigate through them without incident. But every now and then, the universe puts you in a position where your specific knowledge, your particular skills, your unique perspective is exactly what's needed to prevent a tragedy. When that happens, you have to be brave enough to act. You have to be willing to look foolish, to cause a scene, to grab your best friend's wrist and tell her not to eat the cake even though everyone is staring at you like you've lost your mind. Because sometimes you're wrong and you owe everyone an apology. But sometimes you're right, and a little boy gets to grow up and live his life because you trusted yourself. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.